There are moments in a person's life that arrive without announcement. No thunder before them, no shadow cast ahead, no warning at all. They just come, small and quiet and completely without precedent. And when they do, the person they find isn't ready. Nobody ever is. Cord Pasley had spent 55 years on this earth making himself hard. Not cruel, there's a distinction that matters, but hard in the way that the Wyoming winter makes fence posts hard, pressed into the ground. Weathered down, stripped of softness by necessity, he had buried a wife. He had buried a son who never made it past 3 days of breathing. He had weathered 3 failed crop years and 1 catastrophic cattle die-off that took 47 head in a single January. He had watched his neighbor's ranch fold, and his own property line become the loneliest thing he knew. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. Then, on an ordinary October morning in 1889, something walked out of the sage flats and through the gap in his fence, and it stopped in the middle of his property, and it looked at him. It was a horse. Sort of. It stood 28 inches at the shoulder, maybe less. Its mane was the color of dirty wool, its coat a dun brown that matched the October grass almost exactly. It had feet the size of a grown man's fist, and ears that tilted separately like a rabbit's, like it was listening to 2 different worlds at once. Its eyes were large and dark, and fringed with lashes that had no business being on an animal. Lashes you'd have paid a painter to invent. It looked at Cord Pasley, and it did not run. And Cord Pasley, who had not cried in 20 years, stood there with his hat in his hands, and his jaw working at something that never became a word. And the tears came sideways, the way rain comes in Wyoming, not straight down, but at an angle unexpected, unapologetic, almost violent in how little warning they gave. I was there. I saw it. And I have spent the better part of 3 months trying to understand what I saw. My name is Birdie Lusk, and I have a habit I am not proud of. When something overwhelms me, really gets inside the ribs and squeezes, I wind the long leather shutter-release cord of my camera around my left wrist and pull it loose 1 strand at a time. I've been doing it since my first assignment in '79, when I was asked to photograph a 400-pound prize sow at a Platte County fair, and the animal looked at me with such disconcerting intelligence that I couldn't find the shutter for 6 full seconds. My editor said I missed the shot. I told him the sow moved. The truth was I panicked at being known by a pig. I count the strands. I don't know why. Somewhere between 12 and 30, the breathing usually slows. I am telling you this now because by the time the morning I'm about to describe was finished, I had unraveled that cord so many times I'd lost count, and my wrist was red from the leather, and I had stood still for so long that my boots had sunk a 1/4 inch into the soft ground, and I had taken exactly 0 photographs. This will require explanation. I had arrived at the Pasley Ranch on the morning of October the 15th, 1889, driving a rented buckboard from Cheyenne with a half-plate dry glass camera, a canvas bag of chemical jars, 3 spare plates wrapped in dark flannel, and a letter of assignment from my editor, Hollis Wren, which read in its entirety, Cord Pasley, Laramie County, Hereford operation, 280 acres, reputed prize bull. Get the bull, get the man, keep it short. Hollis Wren wrote every letter like a telegraph, 12 words or less. He believed that excess language was a sign of moral weakness. I had been photographing working ranches for 9 years by this point. I had photographed bulls, stallions, prize boars, champion rams, 2,000-pound shorthorn steers, and one particularly aggressive ewe named Margaret who had broken a man's wrist at the '85 Laramie County Stock Show and seemed proud of it. I was not precious about livestock. I was not sentimental. I was professional and efficient, and I went where Hollis sent me, and I got the image, and I came back and we went to press on Thursday. That was the job. I should tell you about Cord Pasley before I tell you what happened, because without knowing something of him, the rest of this becomes just a strange story about a small animal. It's not. Or it is, but it's also something else entirely, and the something else is Cord Pasley, and Cord Pasley is what I am still thinking about now, 3 months gone. He was 55 years old in October of '89, 6'1" and spare of flesh in the manner of men who have worked outdoors their entire lives and had very little interest in sitting down. His face was the color and texture of old saddle leather, not as a flattery but as a fact, and his hands were the kind of hands that told you everything without being asked. Knuckle-scarred, the left thumb slightly crooked from an old break, the palms carrying a permanent callous ridge from rain work. He had gray in his hair and gray in his beard and gray in his eyes, a consistent palette. He wore the same hat every day, a brown Stetson with a sweat-stained crown and a crease that he had never attempted to fix. And he wore it the way men wear hats they've had since before they became the person they are now. He was not unfriendly. That matters to say because the natural assumption about quiet men is that they are cold, and Cord Pasley was not cold. He shook my hand when I arrived. He showed me where to tie the buckboard horse. He brought out 2 tin cups of coffee without being asked, which is a more profound act of hospitality on a Wyoming ranch than it might seem elsewhere, because the coffee was good and he'd clearly brewed it that morning and not the previous evening, which is the difference between a man who was expecting company and a man who actually thought to prepare for it. He just didn't talk much. Not because he had nothing to say. I've learned, after 9 years of arriving uninvited at strangers' properties with a camera and a mandate to observe, to distinguish between people who are quiet because they are empty and people who are quiet because they are full. Cord Pasley was the second kind. The fullness sat behind his gray eyes, behind that carefully still jaw, behind the hands that he kept occupied at all times, adjusting the coffee cup, resting on the fence rail, moving to check a latch he'd already checked twice. He was a man carrying a substantial interior weight, and he had learned long ago that putting it into words only made it heavier. His wife, Me, had died in 1882, 7 years prior. He mentioned her once in the first 10 minutes and then not again. He didn't say past or gone or any of the softer words people use. He said simply Me died in 82, the way you'd state the year a fence section blew down matter of fact because the matter was a fact and dressing it up changed nothing. He had a hand, a boy of 19 named Doyle, who lived in the bunkhouse and who had the nervous energy of someone who had only recently become tall enough to do adult work and hadn't entirely reconciled himself to it. Doyle talked in inverse proportion to Cord's silence. He told me within approximately 4 minutes of introduction that he'd worked the ranch since 17, that his mother lived in Casper, that he had never eaten a decent egg outside of this property because Cord kept good hens, and that the prize Hereford bull I'd come to photograph was named Emmett, and that Emmett had opinions. "About what?" I asked. "About most things," Doyle said, with a gravity that suggested he had thought about this at length. Emmett was, in fact, a formidable animal, 2,100 pounds, deep red-brown, with the wide shoulders and settled stance of an animal that had long since established his place in the world's hierarchy and seen no reason to revisit the question. I photographed him against the fence line with the morning light coming from the east, which gave the image a cleanliness I was pleased with. Cord stood just outside the frame, not because I asked him to, but because he seemed to understand instinctively that I wanted the animal, not the man, and he moved accordingly. That was the job done by 9:15 in the morning. I should have packed the plates, loaded the buckboard, thanked Cord Pasley for his time, and driven back toward Cheyenne. I should have done that. Instead, Doyle came sprinting from the direction of the south pasture, actually sprinting, which I had not seen a 19-year-old do with genuine urgency since I photographed a fire at a grain depot in '83, and he was making a sound that I can only describe as pre-verbal. Not words yet, just a shape of sound that was trying to become words and hadn't managed it. Cord turned from the fence with the calm of a man who has seen 19-year-olds sprint before, and is waiting to determine whether the situation warrants his full attention. "What?" he said, not a question, a placeholder while he assessed. Doyle stopped running approximately 4 feet from us, bent at the waist, put his hands on his knees and said, gasping between breaths, "There's South Gap. Something came through the cord. You have to, I don't, I can't." He couldn't finish the sentence. This was notable, given the previously established fact about Doyle's relationship to language. "Breathe," Cord said. "I'm breathing." "Do it better." Doyle straightened. He looked at Cord. He looked at me. He looked back at Cord. "There's a horse," he said, "in the south pasture." Cord's expression didn't change. He owned a horse, a working quarter horse mare named Bess who was currently in the north barn and accounted for. The south pasture was adjacent to open range. Stray horses happened. It was a practical matter. "Loose stock," Cord said. "No," Doyle said. "No, Cord, you need to come see it." Something in Doyle's voice shifted then. Not the volume, he didn't get louder, but the quality of it. The nervous energy drained out of it, and something quieter came in, something almost reverent, and it was that quality, that drop into a lower register, that made Cord pick up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it and put it on. He walked. I followed because, and I will not pretend otherwise, I was curious. I was a photographer. Curiosity was the only qualification the job actually required. Doyle walked between us, his own footsteps shorter now, as if he was managing the pace of what we were approaching. The south pasture was a long, flat rectangle of autumn grass that had gone golden brown by mid-October, bounded on 3 sides by lodgepole fence and on the 4th by a dry creek bed. The fence gap Doyle had mentioned was a section that had been partially repaired, 2 rails replaced, the 3rd still low, and something small had clearly come through it. We came around the side of the barn. We stopped, and there it was. I want to get this right, because I've tried to describe it 3 times now in my private notebook, and I have not yet gotten it right. The animal was standing in the middle of the south pasture, roughly 40 yards from where we stopped, in a pool of October light that hit it at an angle that made the dun coat look almost gold. It had turned to face us when we appeared around the barn. Its ears, both of them, were tilted toward us, independently, the way I said, like 2 antennae finding their signal. It was the size of a large dog, a very large dog, maybe 100 pounds, maybe less. Somewhere between 27 and 29 inches at the shoulder. I measured later with Doyle's help, and we got 28.5, though the animal was not cooperative about standing still for measurement, and the figure may be approximate. It had 4 proportional hooves, a proper mane that fell to the left side of a proper neck, a tail that reached the ground and dragged. It was shaped in every detail like a horse. The proportions were correct. The conformation was real. The shoulder slope, the hip angle, the length of cannon bone relative to the pastern, all of it was horse. But it was the size of a dog. A very large dog. I stood there and I watched my camera, which I had been carrying loose in my right hand, drop to my side. I am not sure when I let it go. I became aware of it hanging there against my leg like I'd forgotten it existed. Cord Pasley had stopped walking. He had stopped approximately 15 feet in front of me, and I could see his back and his shoulders and the set of his neck. And the set of his neck was a thing I cannot fully describe except to say it was the posture of a man whose body has stopped receiving instructions from his mind, because his mind has run out of instructions to give. The miniature horse, I did not have a name for it yet. I am not sure any of us did, looked at Cord. Cord looked at the miniature horse. The October wind went through the dry grass and made a sound like someone turning pages. Cord reached up with his right hand and took off his hat. Men on Wyoming ranches do not take off their hats in the field. It is not a gesture they make. They take off hats in kitchens and at funerals and occasionally in churches and nowhere else. The hat is a working tool, not a courtesy prop. You keep it on. Cord took his hat off. He held it at his side in his right hand, and he stood there with the wind moving through his gray hair, and I watched his jaw work the way I described, trying to find a word, any word, and not finding one. And then I saw what I had not expected to see. I watched his face come apart. Not collapse, not crumple, come apart the way something tightly wound releases. The jaw loosened. The line of his mouth changed. And then the tears came, sideways in the Wyoming wind, exactly the way I described them at the beginning, because that is how they came, not falling but moving, blown at an angle by the October gusts, running back along his cheekbones rather than down his face, as if even his grief had been reshaped by this landscape. He didn't make a sound. I stood behind him and I watched, and I had my camera in my hand, and I did not raise it. I wound the shutter cord around my wrist. I counted. 12 strands, 14, 16. The miniature horse stood in the October light, ears tilted, and waited. And Cord Pasley, rancher, widower, 55 years of hard Wyoming living compressed into one spare and weathered man, stood 15 feet away from it with his hat in his hand and tears running sideways off his cheekbones, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and he did not look away. I was at strand 22 before I thought to breathe. Doyle was beside me. I had forgotten him entirely. I glanced sideways and found him standing with his arms at his sides, and his mouth slightly open, and his expression the expression of a 19-year-old who has just witnessed something he does not have the experience yet to classify. He was very still. For Doyle, the stillness was its own measure of the moment. He leaned slightly toward me and said, in a voice just above a whisper, "What is it?" "It's a horse," I said. "It can't be." "It is." He looked at it again. The animal had lowered its head and was nosing the dry grass, unconcerned, as if it had decided that the two large creatures standing by the barn were not a threat and could be ignored while the more pressing question of whether there was anything worth eating in this particular patch of ground was addressed. "Is it sick?" Doyle asked. "Is that why it's small?" "No," I said. I was almost certain of this. I had photographed enough livestock to know the difference between an animal stunted by illness and an animal that was simply constitutionally built this way. The coat was healthy. The eyes were clear. The movement when it moved its head was fluid and purposeful. It was not sick. It was just small, extraordinarily, inexplicably, precisely small. Cord Pasley had still not moved. I counted to 30. He put his hat back on. He walked forward. I want you to understand what I mean when I say he walked forward. He did not stride. He did not approach the way a man approaches an animal to assess it. Purposeful, professional, reading the animal's body language with the practiced eye of a stockman. He walked the way people walk when they are being very careful not to break something fragile, not because the thing ahead of them is fragile, but because the feeling inside them is, and the movement of walking is the only thing holding that feeling in place. Slow, deliberate, one boot in front of the other. The miniature horse looked up when he was 20 feet away. It raised its head and tilted those extraordinary ears toward him, and it watched him come. Its expression, and I am aware that attributing expression to an animal is a photographer's indulgence, but I am standing by it, was not fearful. It was attentive. It was the expression of an animal doing the primary work of animals, which is to determine, is this thing a threat? And it was running the determination and arriving slowly at an answer, and the answer appeared to be no. Cord stopped 10 feet from it. He crouched down. A 55-year-old man with the kind of knee history that Wyoming ranching inevitably produces, and he lowered himself down onto his haunches in the October grass with a slowness that had nothing to do with his knees and everything to do with intention, and he was eye level with the miniature horse now, roughly, or close to it. The animal's shoulder was perhaps 6 inches above where his eyes were when he crouched, and they looked at each other. I had 28 strands of shutter cord around my left wrist. I was not taking photographs. I want to explain once why I was not taking photographs, because it is a thing I have had to explain to myself repeatedly since, and I am still not entirely satisfied with my explanation, but it is the best I have. I am a professional. My job is to observe and record. The camera is the record, and the shutter is the act of recording, and I should have been recording. But there are moments, I have had perhaps a dozen in 9 years, when the act of recording feels like a violation of something that is not mine to take. When the thing happening in front of you belongs to the people and the beings inside it, and inserting yourself, even behind a lens, even silently, feels like walking through a private door without knocking. This was one of those moments. What was happening between Cord Pasley and that small horse in the south pasture of his October ranch was not mine. I had no claim on it. I was an accidental witness, and the only courtesy I could offer was to witness it without consuming it. So I stood, and I watched, and Cord put out his right hand, the one with the crooked thumb, slowly, palm up, fingers loose, the way you present a hand to any animal you are trying to not frighten. And the miniature horse stretched its neck forward, and its muzzle, a muzzle the size of a large apple, round and velvet dark, touched his palm. Doyle made a sound beside me, not a word, a sound. Low and involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when they see something they will spend the rest of their life remembering. I said nothing. The October wind moved through the dry grass. Cord Pasley kept his hand exactly where it was, and the miniature horse kept its muzzle exactly where it was, and they stayed that way for a period of time that I could not, afterward, estimate with any accuracy. Long enough that my left wrist had the cord wound around it so many times the leather was creasing. Long enough that the light shifted, and the angle changed, and the pool of gold moved a foot to the south. Long enough. When Cord finally stood, with the care of a man who does not want to make a sudden movement near something he has just persuaded to trust him, the miniature horse stepped back 2 small steps, and then stopped and watched him rise. He looked at it. He looked at Doyle. He looked at me. His face was the face of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and is only now registering that other people are present. He said, "When you last checked that south gap?" "Week ago," Doyle said. His voice was slightly thick. He cleared it. "Meant to get to it this week." "Get to it today?" "Yes, sir." "And get it right," Cord said. "Full 3 rails." "Yes, sir." He looked back at the miniature horse. The animal had gone back to nosing the grass, its rabbit ears swiveling idly. Its tail dragged in the dirt. It was 28.5 inches tall, and it was the most naturally, unself-consciously present thing I had ever seen. "Don't want it getting back out," Cord said. Doyle and I both registered this sentence. We looked at each other briefly. Cord had just decided to keep it. He had not said so. He would not, I suspected, say so. He would simply fix the fence so the animal couldn't leave and the animal would stay, and that would constitute the decision. This was the economy of a man who had long since stopped spending words on things that could be accomplished with actions. I wound the cord off my wrist. 29 strands. I tucked the shutter cord back into my camera bag, and I stood in the October grass of Cord Pasley's south pasture, and I thought about what I had just witnessed, and I did not know yet on that first morning what it meant. I only knew it wasn't finished. I knew I wasn't going back to Cheyenne that afternoon. I came up with an excuse for Hollis, told him the weather was turning, told him I needed another day for a second exposure of Emmett in different light. And I went to the rooming house in Grover, which was 9 miles east and which had 2 rooms and a landlady named Mrs. Stell who charged 30 cents a night and did not ask questions, which was all I needed. I drove back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the 3 mornings after those. By the end of the first week, I had a name for the animal. I had not given it one. I would not presume to name a man's horse, but Cord had not given it one either. And in the absence of a name, Doyle had started calling it by a description, which is what people do when they are waiting for the actual name to arrive. Doyle called it Small. "Small's in the south pasture," Doyle would say in the morning. "Small ate all the way to the east fence already," he'd report, with the proprietary pride of a young man who has unexpectedly become attached to something he did not ask for. Cord never called it anything. He just went to the south pasture after breakfast each morning and stood at the fence and looked, and when the miniature horse came to the fence, and it always came to the fence, within 2 or 3 minutes of Cord appearing there, he put his hand through the lower rail and let it investigate his palm. That was the entire ritual. It lasted on average about 10 minutes. He never said anything during it. Sometimes he moved his thumb along the bridge of the animal's nose slowly, and it stood for that. Sometimes he just let his hand rest on its shoulder, its extraordinarily small shoulder, and breathed. I photographed neither of these moments. I am still not sure whether this was professional failure or something else. What I photographed was everything around it: the fence, the pasture, the morning light on the grass, Emmett in the north paddock, indifferent, Bess in the barn, noting the newcomer with a long sideways look of bovine assessment before returning to her hay. Doyle fixing the south gap fence on that first afternoon, the new rails straight and solid, working with a concentration that suggested he understood without being told that he was building something more than a fence repair. I photographed all of that, and I photographed Cord's back once at the fence in the morning light. Just his back, the hat, the straight spine, the right hand through the lower rail, with the miniature horse a blur of dun brown at the rail's other side. I developed that photograph later in Cheyenne. I looked at it for a long time. It was not the photograph Hollis had sent me for. It was the only photograph that mattered. On the 6th morning, I asked Cord about his wife. I do not know what made me ask. I am not usually a person who asks. I observe. I document. I find that questions interrupt the thing they are trying to understand. But we were drinking the morning coffee. His habit of producing 2 cups had persisted across the week, and I had stopped waiting to be offered and simply accepted it as a given of the day. And the miniature horse was visible from the kitchen window, a small shape in the south pasture, and Cord was looking at it the way he always looked at it when he thought no one was watching, and something about the quality of that look made me ask. "What was me like?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Small," he said. He said it without apparent irony. But I watched his hands tighten slightly around the tin cup, and I watched the words settle over the room, and I understood that the coincidence, if it was one, was not lost on him. Had perhaps not been lost on him since the first morning. She liked small things, he said after another pause. Couldn't walk past something small without stopping. Baby rabbits, a little wildflower that came up in the wrong place, a half-grown kitten the hands brought in from town one winter. He paused. Drove me half to distraction. She was always stopping. And you weren't a stopper, I said. Never saw the point, he said. Things needed doing. And now... He looked down at the tin cup. He ran his thumb along its rim, the crooked thumb, the old break. Now, he said slowly, I think the point might have been that stopping is the thing. The stopping's not the interruption. He paused for a long time. The stopping is the thing. He did not look at me when he said this. He was looking out the window at the south pasture. I wound the cord around my wrist. I drove back to Cheyenne at the end of that first week and filed my Hereford report, 2 photographs of Emmett, one of the operation's feed barn, a brief text note on the herd management approach, and Hollis accepted it without comment, which was his version of approval. He never praised you. He just didn't reject things. I told him I had a second assignment developing in Laramie County, that I needed another 2 weeks before returning. He asked what the subject was. I told him it was a livestock situation with unusual dimensions. He was quiet for a moment and then said, in his 12-word maximum, "Don't come back without a photograph worth something." He hung up. I turned around and drove back toward Grover. I want to be honest about why. It was not entirely about Cord Pasley, though Cord Pasley was certainly part of it. It was not entirely about the miniature horse, though the miniature horse was an extraordinary subject, and the kind of thing that any photographer with a working eye would want to document properly. It was about the question I had not been able to stop turning since the first morning, the one that had been sitting in my chest for 6 days like a smooth river stone, cool and persistent and slightly heavy. What does it mean when a person who has spent 20 years building a wall, carefully, deliberately, necessity by necessity, suddenly stops? Not breaks down, not collapses, just stops. Just opens a hand. I did not have an answer. I wanted to keep watching until I had something closer to one. By the second week, the miniature horse had a name. It happened on a Wednesday, the way most things that matter happen, unexpectedly, in the middle of something else, without ceremony or announcement. Cord had been repairing a hinge on the south barn door, one of those jobs that was supposed to take 20 minutes and had been absorbing an hour because the door frame had also rotted where the hinge screws bit. And now the frame needed replacing, which required finding the right lumber, which was in the back of the equipment shed, which had to be excavated before the lumber could be retrieved. Doyle was in the equipment shed making the kind of sounds that accompany excavation of accumulated ranch equipment. The clank of metal on metal, the grated scrape of something that hadn't moved in years being persuaded to move now, the occasional muffled word that I suspected was a profanity reduced to its consonants. I was sitting on a fence rail across the yard with my notebook writing because I had started keeping 2 notebooks, one for the official record, one for the true record, and the true record was fuller than I had expected. The miniature horse was in the south pasture. It had taken to visiting the south barn fence at intervals throughout the day, pushing its muzzle through the lowest rail and investigating whatever was on the other side, and then wandering off again. It was not a troubled animal. It was not anxious or uncertain. It moved through Cord's property with the comfortable authority of an animal that has decided this is an acceptable place to be without making any further declaration about permanence. Cord came out of the south barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the equipment shed, where Doyle's excavation sounds were intensifying in a direction that suggested lumber was being found, but at some cost. He looked at the south pasture, where the miniature horse was presently standing at the fence doing its muzzle investigation. He stood there for a moment with the rag in his hands. Then very quietly, without looking at me, he said, "Me called things what they were." I waited. Wasn't sentimental about names. Thing was what it was. He looked at the miniature horse. "Little thing," he said, not to me, not quite to himself, to the air maybe, to the distance between himself and the animal. And then he said, plainly, the way you say a thing that has already been decided, "Mite." He went back into the barn. I wrote it in the true notebook. Mite, when Doyle emerged from the equipment shed 20 minutes later with a length of lumber over one shoulder and the expression of a man who has won a minor war, I told him. Cord named it. He set the lumber down. What'd he call it? Mite. Doyle was quiet for a moment. He looked at the south pasture. Mite was there, small and settled, one ear forward and one ear turned toward the equipment shed, which was still making settling sounds. That's a good name, Doyle said. It was. The practical question, what Mite was and where Mite had come from, was one that occupied the second week considerably more than it had the first. In the first week, the fact of Mite had been the overwhelming thing, and the question of origin had receded. By the second week, we had all adjusted sufficiently to the fact that Cord Pasley's south pasture contained an extraordinarily small horse that the practical questions began to resurface. Miniature horses were not entirely unknown in 1889. They existed. There was a documented lineage, primarily from Shetland crossings, though some argued for an older Iberian strain, and they had been a curiosity in Europe for 2 centuries, appearing occasionally in the drawings and records of foreign travel writers with the slightly dazed tone of people who had seen something they weren't prepared for. There was a small population in the eastern states, where they appeared occasionally at fairs as novelties, and there was some deliberate breeding program in Virginia that I had read about vaguely without retaining specifics. In Laramie County, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1889, I had heard of nothing like this. Cord sent Doyle into Grover to ask around. Doyle came back with 3 things: a pound of coffee beans from Mrs. Stell, who had given them as a gift because she found Doyle charming, a rumor that old Harv Geisert, who ran the feed store and had been doing so since before statehood, had seen a small horse some years back, and the information that the Sutherland Ranch, 12 miles north, had lost 2 yearlings and a draft pony in a fence breach during a September storm. None of this explained Mite. Cord went to see Harv Geisert himself on Thursday of the second week. I drove him because Cord's working truck, a lumber and ironwork wagon that he drove to town when necessary, had a front wheel that was making a sound he didn't trust on a 12-mile round trip, and I had the buckboard, and I offered. He accepted without making a production of it, which was the Cord Pasley version of gratitude. Harv Geisert was a man of about 70 with one dramatically bushy eyebrow, the left one having grown to a length and density that the right one had declined to match, and the considered pace of speech of a man who has been in the same location for 40 years and sees no reason to rush anything. He thought about Cord's description for a while. He took a long sip of coffee. He looked at the ceiling of the feed store with the expression of someone reviewing a private catalog. "Dutchman's horses," he said eventually. Cord waited. "Fellow come through about Lord 12, 14 years ago, out of Colorado, had 2 of 'em, a pair of small horses no bigger than you're describing, drove 'em like a carriage team, had a little open cart rigged for 'em." He paused. "Nicest built little things you ever saw, light through and through, built like proper horses, just small." He made a small gesture with his hand indicating smallness. "Never knew what line they were, he wouldn't say, said it was a family line, went back 3 generations. "Where'd he go?" Cord asked. "That I don't know. West, I think, California maybe." "He was passing through." Harv set down his cup. "Never knew him to come back." He looked at Cord. "You saying one came onto your property?" "Yes." Harv was quiet for a moment. "That's something," he said. "Yes," Cord agreed. We drove back mostly in silence, which suited us both. About 4 miles out from the ranch, with the sun starting down toward the western hills, and the sage going that particular dark purple it goes in late afternoon light, Cord said, without looking at me. 12 to 14 years. That put the Dutchman's horses passing through around 75 or 76. "Yes," I said. "Me died in 82. He paused. "She would have seen them if she was going to town that year." Another pause. "She stopped for everything." I kept my eyes on the road. "She might have stopped for those," he said. "She would have liked them." He paused one more time. "She might have told me about them and I didn't listen." His voice didn't change when he said this last part. It didn't break or thicken. It was perfectly level. But the words carried something inside them, a weight of such particular and specific regret that I felt it as a physical sensation, a pressure behind the sternum. A man thinking about all the times he didn't stop. All the times things were stopped for, and he didn't see the point. I said nothing. Sometimes nothing is the only thing that fits. I called Hollis from the telegraph office in Grover on Saturday of the second week. He was brief, as always. "What is the photograph?" he asked. I told him about Mite. I told him about the ranch, the fence, the morning ritual at the south pasture rail. I told him about Cord Pasley, widow, cattle man, 55 years of Wyoming, and about the morning the tears came sideways and the hat came off. There was a pause that, for Hollis, represented either serious interest or serious annoyance. "Get the photograph," he said, "the one that matters." He hung up. He was right. I had been avoiding it. I had been taking everything around it, the fence, the grass, the barn door, Emmett, Bess, Doyle with the lumber. And I had been constructing a careful border of images around the one image I had not yet taken, which was Cord Pasley in the south pasture with Mite. I had told myself it was about access, about the right moment, about not intruding on something private. These were true enough as far as they went, but they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was afraid of what the photograph would be. I was afraid it would reduce something. Photography reduces things. That is, in a technical sense, its primary function. It takes the three-dimensional, time-full, sensory-saturated reality of a moment and compresses it into a flat, two-dimensional, static record. This is both its power and its limitation. The right photograph captures what's essential and leaves behind what isn't. The wrong photograph captures the surface and loses the interior. What was happening in that south pasture was almost entirely interior. How do you photograph a man discovering the point of stopping? I wasn't sure, but I knew I had to try. On Sunday morning of the second week, the 15th day of my presence at or near the Pasley Ranch, I asked Cord for permission. We were at the kitchen table, coffee, the morning light coming through the east window, which was the best light in the house. Mite was visible from the window already at the south fence. "I'd like to photograph you with Mite," I said, "at the fence in the morning." Cord looked at his cup. He said nothing for a while. I had learned by then not to fill his silences. They weren't gaps in attention, they were the thinking. "What would you use it for?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," I said, and then, because he deserved honesty, "Hollis wants the image for the magazine. But I'm not certain that's where it belongs." Another long pause. "Me wouldn't like being written about," he said. "She kept things private." "I know I wouldn't write about her." He considered this. "Mite's not mine," he said finally. "Wandered in doesn't belong to me." "Whose is it?" He looked out the window. His right hand was on the table, and his crooked thumb was pressing slowly down against the tabletop, not impatiently, rhythmically, the way a man keeps time with something he can hear that no one else can. "Don't know," he said. "Doesn't seem to know either." He stood up, he picked up his hat, he went to the door. At the door, he stopped. "After morning chores," he said, not looking at me. He went out. I sat at the table with the empty cup in front of me and the camera bag against the wall and the morning light moving slowly across the floorboards, and I felt something I don't feel often in this work, a kind of seriousness, a kind of responsibility that sat differently than the professional kind. This wasn't about getting the image for Hollis. This was about getting it right for Cord. For me, in the lateral and complicated way that dead people can still be owed something by the people who loved them. I wound the shutter cord once around my wrist. Twice. Then I unwound it. I picked up the camera. I went outside. Morning chores at the Pasley Ranch took about 2 hours, feeding Emmett and the herd, feeding and watering Bess. Checking the north fence where a section had been showing stress. Clearing a blockage from the water trough at the east end of the property. Mending the brace on the south barn door, which had been a separate project from the hinge situation and had required its own set of materials. Cord did these things in the same order every morning without consulting a list or any external reminder, because they had been the same things in the same order for 30 years, and the order was in his hands and feet now, not in his head. I walked the circuit with him that morning. I'd been doing it on and off across the 2 weeks, mostly because I liked walking and the ranch was good to walk. but also because I had found that being present during ordinary work produced more genuine information about a person than any planned interview or formal photograph ever did. Cord said more, not much more, but more, when his hands were occupied with something. When there was something in front of him that required the technical attention of his body, his interior attention wandered, and some of what it found there came out. What came out that morning was a digression about the water trough at the East End, which had been his father-in-law's installation in '71, and which he'd been meaning to replace for 4 years, but hadn't because me had liked the look of it. That it was a heavy old iron trough painted dark green, and that me had planted something. He couldn't remember what now in the ground around its base, and that the plant still came up every spring, smaller each year. That he didn't know its name, the plant, that he'd never asked. He said this last part with the same tone he'd used about possibly not listening when me told him about the small horses. The tone of specific, quiet, particular regret. Not guilt. It wasn't guilt, exactly. Guilt implies something you could have fixed. This was different. This was the recognition of things that had been available and not taken. The stopping that hadn't happened. The name of a plant unasked. By the time we reached the south pasture fence, it was past 9 o'clock. Mite was there, as it always was, within a minute of Cord appearing, the small shape moving through the October grass with its characteristic unhurried authority, ears tilting, tail dragging. Cord put his arms through the middle rail of the fence and leaned on it. Mite came to the rail. I positioned myself about 20 feet to the side, far enough that I was not intrusive, close enough that the light was good, and I raised the camera. And I stopped. I stood there with the camera raised, and I didn't press the shutter. Because what I was looking at, in that morning light, with the dun-brown pasture behind it, and the pale October sky above, and Cord's weathered hands through the fence rail, what I was looking at was something I did not trust glass and chemicals to capture. Cord had put his right hand through the lower rail, palm up, the crooked thumb loose, and Mite had placed its muzzle in his palm. And they were just there together in the morning light, not performing anything, not producing anything, not accomplishing anything. Just there, I thought about what Cord had said in the kitchen, the morning after I'd asked about me. The stopping is the thing. I put the camera down. I did not take the photograph. I have thought about this decision every day since. There are decisions you make in the field that you revisit for the rest of your professional life. Sometimes you revisit them with regret, the shot you didn't take, the moment you hesitated, the shutter you didn't press. Sometimes you revisit them with a complicated feeling that isn't quite regret and isn't quite peace. Something in between those two things. Something that has no name because the situation that produced it is too specific to require a general word. I revisit the morning at the south pasture fence with a complicated feeling. Not every day, most days. I stayed at the Pasley Ranch through the end of October. By the 3rd week, Mite had become, without declaration, without ceremony, without any official act of incorporation, part of the property, not part of the livestock. Cord had been clear about that, in the oblique way he was clear about most things. Mite was not penned with Emmett's herd. Mite was not kept in the barn with Bess, though Bess had by this point made a comprehensive survey of the new arrival and arrived at a verdict of tolerant indifference, which from a working quarter horse is about the highest compliment available. Mite had the south pasture. It also had, increasingly, the run of the space between the south pasture and the south barn, and occasionally the yard between the barn and the house, where it would appear without announcement and investigate whatever was happening with the focused, unhurried attention of a small animal that has decided everything in its immediate environment is worthy of evaluation. It investigated the woodpile. It investigated the water barrel. It investigated my camera bag with a thoroughness that suggested it suspected the bag contained something edible, which it did not, but I respected the inquiry. It investigated Doyle's boots on the occasion when Doyle had left them outside the bunkhouse door to air, and it moved them approximately 3 feet to the east by the time Doyle noticed, which Doyle reported with an affronted dignity that was difficult to take seriously given that he was simultaneously grinning. Doyle had become, by the 3rd week, Mite's dedicated secondary person. He didn't have Cord's place in the hierarchy. Mite made that clear in the careful, decisive way that horses make hierarchies clear. But he had a solid second position, built on regular proximity, and the discovery that Doyle's coat pockets sometimes contained pieces of dried apple, which Mite found relevant. "You can't keep feeding it from your pocket," Cord told him on a Tuesday morning. "It'll be in your coat every 5 minutes." "It's already in my coat every 5 minutes," Doyle pointed out. There was a pause. "All right," Cord said, which was, in the economy of Cord Pasley's language, a concession. "I found the plant name in the 3rd week. It was not through any particular research effort. It happened the way a lot of things happened at the Pasley Ranch, sideways, while something else was being attended to. I had walked the east fence line with Cord on a Wednesday to look at a section he thought might need restringing before the first hard freeze, and on the way back I stopped at the old green trough, Me's trough, to look at what was growing at its base. It was a low, spreading plant with small, round leaves that had gone partly gold in the October cold. Not much of it left in the season, but enough to identify. I knew it by its common name, had seen it in gardens in Cheyenne, and once on the windowsill of the rooming house in Laramie in a painted tin. "Creeping thyme," I told Cord. He was quiet for a moment. "Thyme," he said. "Yes." He looked at the plant. He looked at it for a while in the way. He looked at things when he was doing the interior thinking. "She planted that in 78, he said. Said she'd read it like being near water." He paused. "She was always reading about things, wrote away to catalogs, used to drive me." He stopped. Started again. "I never paid much attention to what she was reading." He stood with his hat in his hands, not at his side, but in both hands, the brim between his fingers. And he looked at the thyme and then at the trough, at the dark green iron of it, paint peeling now around the rim. "Thyme," he said again, just to have said it, to have the word. He put his hat back on. We walked back. I wrote it in the True notebook that night. Me planted thyme. He didn't know its name for 11 years. Now he does. I looked at the sentence for a while. I didn't add anything to it. The hard conversation happened on a Friday. I had been at or near the ranch for 3 weeks by then, and I had felt it building the way weather builds, pressure you register before you see the clouds. It happened in the evening, which was unusual. We did not often talk in the evenings. Cord's pattern was to finish the supper dishes. He washed them himself, had since me died in the same order every night, bowl first, then the plates, then the cups, then the pots, and then to sit in the front room with a book for perhaps an hour before going to bed at 9. He read slowly. He read things with maps in them. I had noticed a worn atlas, a territorial survey volume, a small book about the geology of the Laramie Range. He was not an impatient reader. He was not in a hurry to finish anything. On this particular Friday, he came into the front room with his book and sat down and opened it, and closed it again and looked at the window. "You're going back to Cheyenne?" he said. "Yes," I said, "probably next week." He nodded. "Photograph," he said. "Did you get what you needed?" And there it was, the question I had been carrying. I had taken photographs across the 3 weeks. I had good ones, technically strong, well-composed, properly exposed. I had the back of Cord at the fence photograph with Mite's face through the rail, which was the best thing I'd made in years and which I still was not certain I could publish. I had the south pasture in early morning light with Mite a small shape against the gold grass, remarkable in its understatement. I had Doyle with Mite's nose in his coat pocket, which was an image that would make anyone who saw it immediately understand something true about loyalty. I had the green trough. I had the time. I had not taken the photograph of Cord's hands on Mite's muzzle. I thought about telling him this. I thought about what he would say. He saved me the decision. "I'm not asking for my sake," he said. "Asking because I want to know if you got what you came for. Or something different." "Something different," I said. He considered this. "Is the different thing useful?" I thought about Hollis, about the magazine, about the audience of farmers and ranchers across 5 territories who read Frontier Agricultural Illustrated for reports on prize stock and breeding operations and the practical business of making a living from the land. "For the magazine, probably not," I said. "For me, yes." He looked at his book without opening it. "Me kept a journal," he said. "Didn't show me after she died. I read it." He paused. "Some of it." He didn't say what was in it. He didn't need to. The quality of the pause was information enough. "She noticed things," he said. "Noticed them and wrote them down, things I walked past." He set the book aside. Drove me to distraction, all that stopping, all that noticing. I thought, what's the use of it? Nothing gets done. He looked at the window. Time, he said. Right there 11 years, didn't know its name. I wound the cord around my wrist. Once, twice, I let it go. The use of it, I said carefully, is the knowing. He looked at me. Yes, he said, just that, yes. He picked the book back up. He opened it. He turned to whatever page he was on. After a moment he said, without looking up, "The magazine photograph. You can use it if it's useful to you. Don't need credit." I looked at my notebook. "Thank you," I said. He turned a page. My last morning at the ranch was a Monday. The 1st of November, 1889. I remember this precisely because the date carried weight. November was the turn in Wyoming. It was the month when the land stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was, which was cold and large and entirely indifferent to the preferences of the people on it. The sky that morning was the particular blue that comes only in early November, a hard, distant blue with no warmth in it, technically beautiful, emotionally uncompromising. I loaded the buckboard before breakfast. Camera bags, chemical cases, notebooks, the spare flannel-wrapped plates. Bess watched from the barn doorway with her characteristic sideways assessment. Cord made coffee. He put 2 cups on the table. We drank in the kitchen with the east window light coming in the way it always did, and I thought about how I had sat in this chair, at this table, looking at this window, for most of 3 weeks' worth of mornings, and how ordinary it had become, and how the ordinary of it was the whole point, and how I had almost missed that entirely. Doyle came in from the bunkhouse, stamping his boots, carrying the cold of the yard with him. He poured himself a cup without asking. He sat down. He looked at my bags visible through the window. "You're leaving today," he said. "Yes." He wrapped his hands around the cup. He had the expression of a young man who is trying to look practical about something he is not entirely practical about. "You'll come back," he said, not a question exactly. "Maybe," I said honestly. He nodded once, like this was acceptable, and drank his coffee. After breakfast, Cord went to the south pasture. I followed, as I had done every morning for 3 weeks. Mite was there, of course. The small shape in the November grass, the dun coat, the dragging tail, the rabbit ears tilting at the sound of Cord's footsteps. Cord went to the fence. He leaned on it, arms through the middle rail. Mite came. I stood the distance I always stood, with the camera in my hand. And I thought about what I hadn't done the last time I'd stood here with the camera raised. I thought about Hollis's 12-word mandate. I thought about what the right photograph was. I thought about Me's journal, the things she noticed, time by the water trough. Small horses stopping her mid-stride. The deliberate, diligent, unsentimental work of noticing the things that you pass. I raised the camera. Cord had his right hand through the lower rail, palm up. Mite had its muzzle in his palm. I had the angle. I had the light, that hard November blue overhead, the morning sun at 45 degrees from the east, hitting the fence and the pasture and the small dark muzzle in the pale hand with a clarity that left nothing soft and nothing hidden. I had everything. I held the shutter. I held it. And then I lowered the camera. I didn't take the photograph. I'm not entirely sure I can explain it, even now. I had decided in the kitchen that morning that I was going to take it. I had thought through the composition, the exposure, the decision to publish or not publish. I had made my peace with Hollis and with the magazine and with the use or non-use of what I'd witnessed. I had prepared. And then I was standing at the fence with the angle and the light and the camera raised, and Cord's crooked thumb was moving slowly along the ridge of Mite's nose, and Mite was standing completely still for it, not tolerated still, not endured. Still, but genuinely still, the stillness of an animal that has found a thing it wants to stay for, and something happened. Not a decision. A recognition. I recognized that this moment, this particular 10 minutes at the south pasture fence on the first morning of November, 1889, with the hard blue sky above, and the November light across the dry grass and Cord Pasley's crooked-thumbed hand on Mite's velvet nose, was not available for the record. Not because it was private, not because Cord hadn't given permission. Because it was already complete. Already whole. Already everything it was ever going to be, right there in itself, not needing to be carried anywhere. Some things are only themselves in the moment they exist. The camera would have made it something else. It would have made it evidence. It would have made it an argument, a demonstration, a persuasion, proof that something true happened, offered to people who weren't there. It was already true. It didn't need proof. I put the camera in my bag. I stood there and watched. I let it be the last thing I let be itself. I said goodbye to Doyle at the buckboard. He shook my hand with both of his, which was a 19-year-old's version of saying something he didn't have the word for, and I understood it in the spirit intended. Cord walked me to the buckboard. He was carrying something. It was small, a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. He held it out without preamble. "Me's journal," he said. "Not all of it, one page, I tore it out." He paused. "She mentions the small horses, the Dutch fellows passing through, 75 or 76. He looked at the paper. "She describes them, describes stopping." He looked at me. "Thought you might want it." I took the paper. It was a single folded page, yellowed at the edges with the handwriting of a woman who had thought before she wrote, small, deliberate, the letters not beautiful but precise. I did not read it there. I held it. "Thank you," I said. "She'd have liked someone noticing," he said. He looked at Mite, who had followed from the south pasture to the south barn fence and was watching the buckboard with calm, interested ears. "She'd have liked knowing the noticing had a use." He put out his hand. I shook it. He went back toward the barn. I climbed up to the buckboard seat. I gathered the reins. The horse snorted in the November cold, its breath a white cloud. I looked back once. Cord was at the south barn fence. Mite was at the fence. His hand was through the lower rail. I turned the buckboard toward the road. I drove. I read Me's page that night, in the room at Mrs. Stell's rooming house in Grover, with the lamp turned up and the November wind working at the window glass. It was 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs about an October morning. She dated it October 12, 1876, when she had been driving to Grover for supplies and had seen on the south road a man with a small open cart pulled by 2 of the smallest horses she had ever laid eyes upon. She had stopped the wagon. She had walked up to them. The man had been amenable to her curiosity. She had put her hand out, palm up, and the nearest one had investigated her palm with a muzzle she described, in her precise, deliberate handwriting, as no bigger than a large apple, round and velvet, and completely serious about its business. She wrote, "I stood there for 10 minutes, perhaps more. Cord would have said I was wasting time. I thought I was doing the most important thing I'd done all week. I still think so." I put the page down. I looked at the lamp. I thought about Cord at the south pasture fence, every morning, the crooked thumb and the small muzzle. I thought about me in the road in October of 1876, palm up, stopped. I thought about the 13 years between those 2 mornings, the 13 years when Cord did not stop, did not see the point, did not understand what was important about the stopping. The years that included Me's death and the unplanted time name and the journals unread and the 3 days of a son who never got a name, a fact Cord had told me once quietly in the middle of a fence line inspection and then not mentioned again. The heavy interior years, the pressed into the ground years. And then a small horse, 28.5 inches at the shoulder, walked through a gap in a fence on an October morning in 1889 and stood in the south pasture and looked at him. And he stopped. I don't know if Mite knew what it was doing. I don't know if it understood anything about the man who had come to its fence every morning with a palm-up hand and a crooked thumb, and 20 years of unlived stopping waiting somewhere behind the gray eyes. I don't know if animals understand the things they do to people, or whether the doing is simply the thing, and the understanding belongs to us. I don't know. I know that the photograph I didn't take is the clearest image I carry. I know that I can see it perfectly, Cord's hand through the rail, the velvet muzzle, the November light, the hard blue sky, and that it has not faded in 3 months and shows no sign of fading. I know that some images are made of light and chemistry, and some are made of the inside of a person who is paying attention. I know that Me Pasley stopped for small things her whole life, and that the small things in the end came back. I filed the Hereford story in November as agreed, Emmett in good light, 2 photographs. Hollis used them both and said nothing, which was approval. In December, I mailed Cord 2 prints, one of the south pasture in morning light with Mite a small shape in the gold grass, and one of the fence repair, Doyle, young and concentrated, the new rails bright in the afternoon light. Not the image I had raised the camera for and not taken, just the ones that could travel. He wrote back in January, 4 sentences. Doyle had fixed the east section of the north fence before the hard freeze, which he said was the first time he'd gotten ahead of the winter rather than behind it. Mite had eaten through the last of the dried apple, and Cord had ordered more from the Grover store. The time at the trough base had come up a little even in December, which he had not expected. He had not expected it. He had looked and been surprised. The last sentence of the letter said, "Me would have said that was the point." I folded it into the true notebook. The page is still there. I have never torn it out. I went back in the spring, April of 1890. The property looked different in the green, less austere, more generous. Doyle had grown another inch and was affecting a mustache with limited success. Emmett remained Emmett. Bess was in foal, which was a practical development that made Cord quietly satisfied. Mite was in the south pasture. Mite would be in the south pasture for the next decade and more, as it turned out, a fact I know only from a letter Cord sent in 1901, which mentioned, without fanfare, that Mite was still there and still came to the fence every morning, and that some things, if you let them stay, simply did. But on that April morning in 1890, I didn't know any of that. I just drove the buckboard down the road from Grover and turned through the gate, and Cord came out of the barn when he heard the wheels, and he raised one hand in the way of men who do not wave but acknowledge, and I raised one back. And then I did something I had not planned to do. I took off my hat. I was wearing a broad-brimmed traveling hat that I always pushed back off my forehead when I was working, and I took it off and held it in my hands the way I had watched Cord hold his that first morning, standing in the October light with the tears running sideways. I held it in my hands. I stood there. I let the April air come through. Cord watched me. He didn't say anything. He just went back into the barn. I wound the camera cord around my wrist one last time 3 weeks later, when I was back in Cheyenne and packing for the next assignment. A shorthorn operation south of Denver. A straightforward job, prize animals, good light, Hollis's 12 words in my pocket. I wound it. I counted. I got to 4. And then I stopped counting. I didn't need the number. I put the camera bag over my shoulder and I walked out into the Cheyenne morning, and somewhere between the rooming house door and the buckboard, I looked up at the sky, that October-cold Wyoming blue that had started all of this, that hard and gorgeous blue, and I thought,